Well, welcome everyone to our Safer World by Design webinar. And today we're going to look at the topic of chemical hazard assessment with Joseph Rinkevich, the founder of Scivera. It'll be about approximately 20 minutes. And if you look on the panel there, you'll see you can prepare some questions. We'll have a good, I hope, discussion at the end and have a chance to ask Joe some good questions. So over you go, Joe. Take over, please.
Barry, thanks very much. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak with everyone today. As Barry said, I'm Joe Rinkevich. I'm founder and president of Scivera. We're a US-based software company. We offer chemical assessment, data gathering, and safer chemicals decision-making functionality through our software platform, SciveraLENS. I'm going to talk a little bit today about the trends that we're seeing as a business in consumer products and how safer chemistry decisions can be made, and then show some examples of some of the work that we're doing. Just a quick walk through the topics we're going to cover today. Quick overview of the business, description of some key functions of SciveraLENS. Going to talk a little bit about how we do and how toxicologists do chemical hazard assessment. Talk a little bit specifically about the rules and the approach that we take with our chemical hazard assessment work, Scivera GHS+, and then again, walk through some examples. But before we get started, we wanted to do a quick little survey to see where folks on the webinar come from, what work brings them to this topic. So if you wouldn't mind, I'm going to launch the poll and be grateful if everyone would take a minute to indicate what their particular area of work is, and I think some results will show right up as people put responses in. And if your particular category isn't listed here, feel free to, into the chat or into the questions, add another area so we make sure we capture all of it. Looks like about almost 90% have voted. Give it a few more seconds. Okay, going to close the poll. And it should show results. Here we go. So mostly service providers, but super helpful info. That'll help shape how we cover things today. Really appreciate that. So back to the presentation. Just put a little things into a little bit of context, as I'm sure everyone's pretty familiar. Over the years, over the decades, and in our experience and in my work over the last 25 years or so, the main thing that has driven chemical selection, in addition, of course, to performance and cost and accessibility of a particular chemical or formulation, is regulatory compliance. Most decisions traditionally were made about a chemical if it met the requirements of regulations, in addition to of course, the engineering requirements. But now we're seeing dramatically different sets of requirements for chemical selection. Of course, regulatory compliance is a large driver of decision making, but we're also seeing the need for greater transparency of chemical characteristics, a significant increase in the need for traceability of where chemistry comes from or where materials come from. The requirement to better engage stakeholders, whether that's NGOs or consumers or investors, that's driving chemical selection. Third-party certification is a significant force on whether chemicals are selected, whether they are certified by a third party can be a significant driver in a decision. And then also the process of safer alternative screening and the characteristics of a chemical and the comparative characteristics between one formulation and another. And I'm sure there are others, and it'd be really interesting to hear from the group during the discussion at the end what other drivers are forcing exploration into alternative chemicals. But at the end, chemical selection is changing, and brands, along with SciveraLENS as a platform, are driving this transformation. And wanted us to talk a little bit about why that is. But first, a quick little overview of our business. We were founded in 2008, but for the first 8 years or so, we largely did services. We supported brands thinking about new ways of evaluating chemicals. We had an early version of our software platform that we facilitated that work with, but it was largely a services set of exercises. We're a team of board-certified toxicologists, supporting scientists, software engineers, and experts with decades of experience in sustainability environmental strategy. Over the years, we've built what we feel is a best-in-class chemical hazard assessment repository, and that's very informed decision-making, the process of which I'll get into in a little bit, but very informed decision-making about industrial chemicals, their hazard characteristics, and generating an overall chemical hazard assessment for each industrial chemical. And we have thousands in our repository now, and that's unique in the world, we feel. In 2017, we launched a pure software as a service platform called SciveraLENS Rapid Screen, and that's what we mainly serve into the consumer products, brand, retailer, manufacturing, and raw materials supplier ecosystem. And SciveraLENS is now driving chemical screening transformation in a number of consumer product categories, which we'll show a few examples here in a little bit. Our objective as a software platform and as a business is to enable increased transparency and efficient selection of safer chemicals throughout the consumer product supply chain via an improved access to health and safety information, those chemical hazard assessments. And a critical way of reducing resistance and hurdles in the supply chain is to protect supplier intellectual property while doing all of this work. Put more simply, SciveraLENS enables safer product chemistry decisions and more efficient ways to report achievement downstream. Some key functions of our platform include a comprehensive ingredient and impurity data collection process. So SciveraLENS as a platform makes it very easy for you to gather information from suppliers, for your suppliers to gather information from their suppliers, pull that information down and roll it up into a component, a formulation, a material, and a finished product, all while protecting supplier intellectual property and trade secrets. Generates an instant screening of chemicals against over 400 lists, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. And then provides instant access to, as I mentioned, thousands of verified chemical hazard assessments by Scivera toxicologists, and also a very efficient process for getting at additional chemical hazard assessment verification for new chemicals that come into our knowledge base based on that data collection functionality in the platform. It enables, as I said, secure request upstream of chemical screening results from suppliers and secure reporting downstream of chemical screening results to your customers. And that can be either in form of a certificate for the standards that we offer through SciveraLENS, or a simple chemical hazard assessment for ingredients, impurities, and a rolled up formulation for a raw material or a product. And we do all of the above at scale for dramatically lower cost. And that's the real differentiator in this work. Traditionally, the regulatory regime and regulatory compliance as a standard for doing this work was largely driven by how difficult it has been to get at this greater detail of doing chemical hazard assessment in the consumer product supply chain. A platform like SciveraLENS enables this work to be done at scale and at lower cost, and it's enabling global brands, global retailers, and participants in the supply chain to start to add this work as part of the decision-making process and as part of the business process. So in this first step, which is just the first step of screening against lists, you can zero in on just a single or a handful of lists that are relevant to your category or to your business, or you can expand and screen against over 400 lists. In our system, we have lists categorized into 5 different buckets, and across those 400 plus lists, each of those are categorized in, as I said, you can look at all of them or a subset of them as a first step in the review process. But the real important work is ahead. It's chemical hazard assessment, and it's not list checking. There's a very important distinction between chemical list checking and chemical hazard assessment. Chemical list checking in a formulation will tell you if a problematic chemical is not present in the formulation. But chemical list checking does not tell you anything about the characteristics of the actual formulation and its ingredients or impurities. To get at that actual characteristic information, you need to do a chemical hazard assessment on each ingredient and impurity in a formulation and roll that up to a material and to a product, which we'll talk about coming ahead. Keeping this very accessible and simplified for non-experts and for scale and efficiency, typically chemical hazard assessment gets boiled down to indicators: green light for low hazard, yellow light for moderate hazard, red light for high hazard, and then quite often you see a gray light for insufficient data. Many chemicals still have insufficient data to enable a full chemical hazard assessment, but even knowing a chemical has insufficient data and is not possible for a chemical hazard assessment is useful information, because that's essentially saying that you're flying blind on whether that chemical's characteristics are problematic or not. So seeing that insufficient data indicator is very important for decision making. So with each of those indicators, you as a toxicologist look at over 23 human and environmental health endpoints. And with a full chemical hazard assessment, you'll have information that enables you to draw a conclusion about each of these endpoints and then roll that up to the chemical hazard assessment for the chemical overall. In the case of Scivera and our GHS Plus chemical hazard assessment methodology, we use a variety of sources. Our toxicologists work every day in evaluating individual chemicals by gathering data for each of the endpoints across authoritative bodies, collecting experimental data from a variety of resources, looking at analogous data for similar molecular structures, generating model data, which takes a great deal of expertise and experience using tools like those available in the OECD toolbox, and then ultimately expert judgment, looking at reliability of various data points and weight of evidence, et cetera. So as you're trying to generate a chemical safety assessment for an individual chemical, you start at the foundation and you look at the data points that you're able to gather for each of the 23 or so endpoints. Various data points might indicate different characteristics or different conclusions for that particular endpoint. You then, based on weight of evidence, roll that up to the hazard assessment for that individual endpoint. You do the same thing for the rest of the endpoints. Of course, this is just an example 3 across all those 23 that were listed earlier. And then you can, based on a set of rules, generate a chemical hazard assessment for the chemical overall. You can see in the lower right-hand corner, there's a reference to our GHS Plus chemical hazard assessment methodology. I encourage you to go check that out on our website at any point and either send questions later, or we'd be happy to have a longer discussion on the details of that approach. So then you can see in, as an example screenshot in SciveraLENS Rapid Screen, the way we display this information. It quickly gets very detail-oriented and very complex, and that's how bringing things to scale and managing large amounts of information, even across a simple formulation, an example formulation like this one, you imagine rolling that up to multiple materials or even hundreds of materials, and then rolling that up to multiple products or even thousands of products. really requires a scalable solution like SciveraLENS. You can generate summaries. We build dashboards all the time for particular categories and specific companies. And you can focus on lists of interests and approaches and scoring methodologies to enable more efficient decision making and communicate expectations upstream to manufacturers and suppliers of raw materials. You can also send formulations and results in redacted form, and this is a key way that SciveraLENS protects trade secret and intellectual property information for suppliers participating in the process by delivering results but not trade secret formulation information. So once you've got those chemical hazard assessments done, you can start to apply those to formulations and products overall. So based on the chemical hazard assessment for each ingredient and impurity in a formulation, you can then roll that up to the chemical hazard assessment result for each material in a particular product or packaging system, and then generate a conclusion overall for a product. And that can enable reporting downstream. It can enable better decision making for sourcing components or reformulating individual raw materials. So some examples that we've been working on the last several years. I think one of the most compelling examples is the screen chemistry program that we've helped scale up over the last couple of years. Screen chemistry is a method for evaluating textile chemical formulations developed by Levi Strauss around 2014. Levi Strauss engaged Scivera in 2016 to help scale up and make more cost-effective the program for full textile supplier network. And the important thing here is you can imagine doing it at pilot scale and evaluating a few dozen chemical formulations can be done in a traditional way. But when you get into several hundred factories and several thousand chemical suppliers and tens of thousands of chemical formulations, you need scale, you need automation, you need consistency. And SciveraLENS has enabled that to happen in the Levi Strauss supply chain and then more generally across the apparel and footwear supplier network. The screen chemistry process results in a certified numeric score for any textile chemical formulation. It informs formulators about how to improve potentially the safety and environmental profile of textile chemical formulations, and then it informs the procurement process at textile facilities for sourcing safer chemistries in the facility for products. Scivera's led the screen chemistry certifications, generating over 80%, over 500 in the last 18 months or so during 2019 and 2020. Another great example is the work ongoing in cosmetics formulation and sourcing. You may have heard about this as the clean beauty trend. In most cases, clean beauty is a process of screening against restricted substance lists. Some of the companies engaged in this process, and specifically some with Scivera, are moving beyond the basic list screening methodology and going to understand each ingredient and impurity from a chemical hazard point of view. Gathering actual ingredient and impurity data, screening against a comprehensive set of lists, but also digging into the chemical hazard assessment for each chemical to make informed decisions about ingredients, components, and overall formulations. And then lastly, the retail movement you've seen, I'm sure, driving processes around informed chemical assessment and informed decision making. A major US retailer is moving beyond basic list screening and creating capacity and encouraging suppliers upstream in non-food products to support greater transparency while protecting ingredient information, and also create better information around safer alternatives decision making. Currently, hundreds of items are being screened for safer chemistry by SciveraLENS, and this provides a cost-effective and scalable platform for suppliers to expand safer chemistry. So with that, we wanted to turn it over to some discussion and see if there are any questions about the approach. Happy to dig in on individual slides or topics that we covered during this short overview. But really, we're really looking forward to discussion from the group and any questions that you have.